I got to say that, someone said once that to live in interesting times is what you can ask for. And Greg, we have teed you up perfectly last week with Kavanaugh and what took place, didn't take place there. The market hasn't cooperated in the last couple of days. Trump's rattling the saber at the Fed. Greg puts something out every morning. It's the first thing I get in my inbox at 4:38 every morning. And I tend to turn my iPad on and start reading it. My wife is not happy with me doing that, but it's the first thing I read every day. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Greg.
Well, thanks, Mike. Great to be here. I remember some of you from 2 years ago, and Mike made me remember that 2 years ago, a very humbling experience, I, like most analysts, thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And she did win by 2 million votes, but she didn't win the electoral vote. Maybe 3, yes. So for weeks afterwards, after this great event I had with Mike and all of you, and after the election, I brooded that I got one wrong. I'd never gotten an election wrong before. My friends would try to cheer me up. My wife would. Finally, a friend of mine told me a great joke. Then we'll get serious, but I'll just popped into my mind, which is dangerous. This great joke about someone who saw all the signals, thought he got all the signals right, and got the call wrong, as I did, like a lot of people did. It was about this fellow who was an accountant who woke up one morning to look at his digital clock. It was 5:55. He went downstairs, made some coffee, looked at the thermometer. It was 55 degrees. He was running late, got in the cab. The fare was $5.55. He was starting to think, this is really kind of weird. He added up a whole total of numbers for a client of his. It came to $5,555,000. So being superstitious, he decided to take the rest of the afternoon off and go out to Aqueduct, to go out to the racetrack. So he hopped in a cab. It was a long ride from New York City. It was $55, of course. He got there just in time for the 5th race, and he put down $5,555 on a horse that came in 5th. So sometimes you can get all the signals and still not make the right call. So that joke finally cheered me up after the election. Well, let me start by letting you in on a little secret that you may know, and that is Mike and all of his colleagues are paid to worry. That's our job. We're paid to worry for clients, and right now there's a lot to worry about. So I thought what I would do this evening, and I had prepared this before the last 2 days in the markets, is to talk about things we maybe should worry about, things that maybe we don't have to worry about. I'm going to run down a list pretty quickly. I have been really, really quite bullish all year long. I thought the fundamentals were great, whether it was corporate earnings or a spectacular labor market, moderate inflation. Right across the board, I thought this year's fundamentals were really good, but there's always this nagging concern about things to worry about. So let me start with the first one. The first is, should we worry that much about a trade war? Well, I think a trade war with China will persist for a while, but it looks as if we're starting to see real progress with Mexico, Canada, the EU. We've got to deal with South Korea. Trump, of course, has proclaimed these deals as done deals, but there's details to still be ironed out. But I think the fear that a lot of analysts had a couple of months ago of a really nasty trade war with Canada, for example, slapping 25% tariffs on their cars, those fears have subsided. I do think, though, that we may go many more months before a resolution with China. In Washington, I think it's not well appreciated, but both parties have real issues with the Chinese, a feeling that they steal our technology, they steal our intellectual property, they're not opening up markets, and I think there's a bipartisan feeling that China has to be dealt with pretty harshly. Whether China appreciates that or not, I don't know. So the question becomes then, could this really have a very negative impact on our economy? And the economists that I speak to, who I have a high regard for, are pretty much in agreement that this war with China, if it persists, might detract 2 or 0.3% from GDP. With an economy growing right now at 4%, we can handle that. Maybe it'll add 1/10 or 2 to the inflation rate, but I think we can handle that as well. So while I don't dismiss the trade war, I see signs that things may be improving with key countries, and fearless forecast. I think when President Xi comes to the United States in late November, he and the President will perhaps relaunch personal diplomacy, and I think that may lead to signs that maybe things are going to get better on the trade front. The Chinese aren't just going to give up and cry uncle. They're too proud, I think, to do that. But the Chinese have to worry that their economy is starting to soften, and I think that will lead them to the bargaining table. A second issue that I think we all have to be concerned about is the enormous amount of debt everywhere we go. Everywhere you look, debt seems to be rising. And I must say, I have been stunned to see how utterly indifferent people in Washington now are about the deficit, in both parties. Both parties are equally complicit in this pig out on spending, no constraints whatsoever on spending, and a tax cut that maybe jump-started the economy, but there's no question the tax cuts are going to lose revenue. You might debate how much, but they will lose revenue. And I think because of that, the new estimates are ones you have to take seriously. In the fiscal year that started about a week ago, 10 days ago, it looks as if the deficit will be about $1 trillion in a full employment economy. If you ran a $1 trillion deficit in the heart of a recession, as we did in 07, 08, that's one thing. But to run a $1 trillion deficit with the economy this strong is troublesome. And all estimates that I've seen that I respect indicate that we'll probably be running at $1 trillion annual deficits for the next decade. I mean, that's to me is a big deal and something that eventually the markets may start to really worry about. I think there's two possible outcomes. The first would be a sharp upward spike in interest rates. I'm not persuaded, and the Federal Reserve has done studies finding only a modest correlation between deficits and interest rates, but it's not a good story for interest rates. The second scenario is more troubling, and that is if we continue to run deficits of this magnitude, the real problem becomes debt servicing costs. And many people who have studied this feel that within a decade, debt servicing costs could exceed all domestic spending. It might eat up all domestic spending. Highways, bridges, infrastructure projects like that, healthcare, Coast Guard, you name it. It's going to be hard to spend money on those things when we have to spend so much on debt servicing costs. And I must tell you, when I go to Capitol Hill and I talk to politicians about doing something about the deficit, they look at me like I'm on drugs. Like, why should we risk our next election by embracing prescriptions that nobody likes? Nobody wants to cut spending on anything, Social Security, Medicare, defense. So I think we're in an environment now where there's no willpower, there's no leadership on debt. I think it's a big problem as we go into the next decade, but maybe not an immediate problem over the next few months. A third story, everyone says to me, well, this could really upset the markets, right? We have a little event called an election coming up in about 4 weeks, and I think it's going to be an interesting one, but I'm not sure it's going to have a huge impact on the market. So just follow, if you would, my logic. First of all, I do think the House is going to flip back to the Democrats. I think that's an increasingly easy call. Some of that is just based on history. Since Franklin Roosevelt, a first-term president in his first midterm election has lost, on average, 25 seats. The Democrats this fall need 23 seats to take the House. So just for historical reasons alone, the Democrats, I think, will come pretty close. And then you add the deep anxieties and anger among young people, women, people of color, who I think will turn out in bigger numbers than they turned out in previous midterm elections. I would say that, yeah, the House in all likelihood will flip. Ironically, the outlook in the Senate has gone in the exact opposite direction in the last week or so. In many conservative states, red states like Missouri, Tennessee, Texas, North Dakota, most conservative voters were indifferent. They weren't all that excited about the election, but they've been motivated by the Kavanaugh hearings and all of that implies. And in all of these key states, including Texas, where I thought Ted Cruz was in trouble a month ago, in all of these states, the Republicans have gained a couple points. So I am content saying that the Republicans might actually add a seat or two to their Senate majority, which is a very razor-thin 51 to 49. So I am not in the camp that argues that we're going to have a tidal wave, sweeping Republicans out. Maybe a high surf warning, that's what I've been calling it for the last month or so. The House will flip, I mean, that's a big deal, but I don't see the Senate flipping either. So what does that mean? What does that mean for investors? What does that mean as we go into 2019? First of all, I think that if we do see one of the houses controlled by the Democrats will move aggressively to investigate Trump, subpoena him. I talk to Democrats on the Hill who say in private, they don't say this much in public, but in private they do feel that impeachment could begin. Just a word on impeachment. Everyone says, is there going to be impeachment? My answer has been the same for the last year. Impeachment, maybe. Conviction, highly unlikely. I think that it would result in an acquittal in the Senate, and Bill Clinton, as you recall, about 25 years ago was impeached or indicted, the words are interchangeable, but he was acquitted in the Senate. It's inconceivable to me that there would be 67 votes in the Senate to convict Trump. And one of the things that's not widely appreciated around the country, I think you guys probably know this, but Trump has really adroitly intimidated Republicans in Congress. They don't dare to go against him. If you speak out against Trump in Congress, you're probably going to lose your next primary to someone who is loyal, blindly loyal to Trump. And the strongest critics of Trump in Congress are people who are not seeking re-election, people like Bob Corker, who can say whatever he wants. He's not going to have to go for re-election. Jeff Flake is the same way. So I think Trump's support in the Senate will be sufficient to avoid ousting him. I don't see that happen. That's not to say the markets would not enjoy the spectacle of a trial lasting throughout the spring, but I do not see him getting ousted. What about, you might say, what about Robert Mueller? I think he has collected a treasure trove of information in the last few months. There are many people who have been singing like canaries to Mueller, people who would like to avoid incarceration, who have cut deals. And if Mueller will probably have a lot of juicy stuff, but he's made it quite clear in public and in private that he feels he does not have the authority to impeach. He'll just throw this to Congress and say, do what you will. But I don't see that as being a pivotal. There may be indictments, though. I wouldn't be shocked by that. So that's one clear result of the election. If the Democrats control the House, I do think they'll get much more aggressive in going after Trump. The other story is one that I get in every meeting like this I go to. People will say to me, my goodness, if the Democrats control both houses, does that mean the Trump tax cuts are dead? That the markets could have a real reversal because corporate and individual tax cuts will be killed? And the answer is no, for one simple reason. Trump's veto will be good. There's no doubt in my mind Congress will try to kill the Trump tax cuts, but he'd veto the bill. So I think in 2019 and in 2020, his veto will be solid. That doesn't mean we're going to get a lot done. I mean, the most I could hope for maybe would be an infrastructure bill because it means spending more money. They specialize in doing things like that, as we've already discussed. But I do not see the Trump tax cuts getting undone. 2021 is a different story. We'll see who's president. But I don't necessarily see that even if the Democrats take both houses. I don't see them undoing what Trump has done. Otherwise, I think that, as I said before, there'll probably be gridlock. I have a good friend on Wall Street who calls me up every couple of years and says, Greg, don't forget, gridlock is good because it means they do less harm. And it's entirely possible we'll see that for the next couple of years after this election. So what is there? Is there anything geopolitical? Well, if you want to stay awake at night, I guess you might worry about March 29th, the date in which the UK is supposed to formally leave the EU. Brexit, I think it could be messy. Some people worry about that. Some people worry about Italian banks, Turkish lira. I mean, there's always going to be something to worry about. The Saudi prince who looks like an unsavory guy. But I don't see anything geopolitically now, with North and South Korea getting along wonderfully. I don't see anything geopolitically to worry about. So, isn't there anything for Mike and his colleagues and me to worry about? Yeah, there's one thing. And I've said this all year long, and to me it's the ultimate irony. I think there's a risk the U.S. economy is getting too strong, that the U.S. economy is overheating. I'm not sure we needed as much fiscal stimulus as there was in the tax bill, but that's a moot point at this time. I just see everywhere an economy that's starting to show strains. In the previous quarter, we grew by 4.2%. In the quarter that just ended, we'll probably have growth of about 4%. In this new quarter, the fourth quarter, we'll probably see growth of well over 3%. And everywhere I go around the country, business leaders tell me they have run out of skilled labor. There's an acute shortage of skilled labor and a president who wants to curb legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. So I see that wages finally starting to pick up. I see the Federal Reserve getting nervous about an economy that could be overheating. You cannot sustain GDP growth at 4% for quarter after quarter. You could maybe sustain 2.5 to 3. That would be wonderful. But a 4% sustained growth rate brings with it lots of concerns for this very suddenly beleaguered man named Jerome Powell, who has been the subject of Trump criticism in the last day or two. Imagine the President of the United States, if you're involved in foreign markets, you're a European banker, you hear the President of the United States say, as Trump did yesterday, that the Fed has gone crazy. That's a direct quote. The Fed has gone crazy because they have the temerity to raise interest rates. I would argue they've been slow to raise interest rates. I think they have more work to do. And maybe Powell was not tactful when he said last week that the federal funds rate is not close to neutral. It was a clear sign that there's going to be a rate hike in December, and there's probably going to be 3 more rate hikes next year. So if Trump is tweeting now, you could just imagine how he'll tweet when we have 100 basis points higher on the Fed funds rate in the next 15 months or so. So this will be unprecedented and maybe a little unnerving for the markets to see a president this angry with his Fed chairman. I mean, this Fed chairman is starting to look like Jeff Sessions. I mean, he's sort of looking like a piñata. I mean, the president appoints these people, and then he decides they're no good. And I think that Powell, who cannot be fired, there was ridiculous talk today about him getting fired. No, it's a job that he's got for, I forget how many years, it's 11 or 12 years. So Powell will be there for quite some time. But I do think there'll be friction between the two camps, between a president who I really believe feels that the greatest threat to his reelection is Jerome Powell. Just as Bush the first, George Herbert Walker Bush, blamed Alan Greenspan for his defeat, I think that Trump worries that something similar might happen. There's an old adage, I don't know if you believe in it, Mike, but there's an old adage that bull markets don't die of old age. They're killed by central bankers. So we'll see. I think Powell is smart enough to realize as we go into next year that he can't overdo it. I think he won't overdo it, but the trend on rates is higher. Today, the bond market rallied because stocks did so poorly. It always happens. Yields drop, at least temporarily. But that is the one thing that I worry about. Let me just finish with 5 or 6 minutes on a theme I've been throwing out to my friends. And when I throw this theme out, they throw things at me. They throw knives at me. They throw dinner rolls at me. They yell at me. The theme is that there is a plausible case to be made that Trump can win re-election. Let me give you my logic. That doesn't mean I'm a fan of his, I would hastily add. But let me just give you my logic. First of all, if he wants the nomination, it's his. Who's going to beat him? Mitt Romney? The party hates him. The base hates him. John Kasich? John Kasich lost every state that he ran in against Trump except Ohio, where Kasich is still the governor. And he just barely won Ohio. I don't see anyone else who could take out Trump for the nomination. I think Nikki Haley will be an intriguing player in 2024. She's young enough. She's got plenty of time. So I think if he wants it, he's got it with one little caveat, and that is I do not share the exuberance of Trump's doctors who seem to feel he'll live for 135 years. I think that maybe they're exaggerating. I see someone who despises exercise. He's said publicly he despises exercise. He drives his cart onto the green when he plays golf, which is unheard of. I have a friend who's a Secret Service agent who has traveled with Trump extensively, and my friend says he has never in his life seen anyone with worse dietary habits. Everything's fried, no fruit, nothing, no vegetables, nothing like that. And it's a stressful job. He brags that he only sleeps 4 hours a night. Sadly, I do that quite a bit, but you do that for day after day, you're more prone to making mistakes. A lot of things with his health that you might have to be a little concerned about. And as I always point out, it is an exceptionally stressful job. And he looks angry a lot of the time. The best example I could show of how stressful it is that in April of 1945, just before he died, the photos of Franklin Roosevelt were just harrowing. A dissipated man, hollow eyes, I mean, clearly in horrible health. Franklin Roosevelt was 63 when he died. I Googled it. I saw that. I said, no, he must have been, 77. He was 63 when he died. So it's a stressful job, needless to say. That said, I do think he's the nominee, and then you have to ask the obvious question. Who's going to beat him? I go down to Capitol Hill. I have a lot of good friends who are Democrats who say, we've got a problem in this party, and the problem is the party's getting elderly. You've got Nancy Pelosi, 78. Her chief congressional ally is Steny Hoyer, 78. Her other ally is James Clyburn, 78. Dianne Feinstein's 85. You've got Bernie, who's 76. You've got Biden, who's about to turn 76. I'm beginning to wonder, what about Mondale? He's 90. Maybe they could persuade him. What about Dukakis? I mean, Dukakis lives around here. I think he's 90. This is a party that desperately needs some fresh blood. Yet, at the same time, who are the two favorites? Well, right now, I talk to political reporters, and they all say that in the key states and in national polls, the front runner is Joe Biden. I like him. I've met him. He's a lovely man. He's gone through great personal tragedies with dignity and class, but he's awfully windy. It takes him a half an hour to say hello in the morning. He's prone to gaffes, having to correct gaffes, and frankly, I don't think he's had a new idea in a decade or so, but he's the front runner. He is now the undisputed front runner in the party. Maybe it's like in a long marathon. Someone jumps out to a lead and knowing that somebody else or others will pass you. I think second on the list is still Bernie, who has a financial issue with his wife in Vermont. I'm sure Sean Hannity will have a great time with that. I still can't decide in my own mind if Bernie is just a gadfly provocateur or if he's a serious threat to become the next president. I will say this, I think he would have done better in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan than Hillary Clinton did in the last election, and he certainly feels the same way. And once you get the itch, you never lose it. I think he still has the itch. I think he still might run. Beyond that, then there's a list of 25. I won't keep people here till midnight going through all 25, but there are several names, new names that the country is going to have to look at. Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Kristen Gillibrand, Cory Booker, a long list of people who will be in the top tier. I get questions all the time when I speak to financial groups about Elizabeth Warren, who is not popular among financial groups. There's a feeling that she's very polarizing, hates our industry, but let me tell you, she is running. I have friends who know her and say there's no question that she's going to run. And here's the issue. What if Bernie decides not to run? Who inherits his army of adoring young people? And we have a 25-year-old daughter who loves Bernie because, of course, he'd forgive student debt. And if you're 25, that's like catnip if you hear a politician say, we're going to forgive your student debt. So we asked our daughter, what would you do? What would your friends do if Bernie didn't run? And she answered without hesitation, they'd support Elizabeth Warren. I don't rule her out. I think she may be too polarizing, but I think you can't overlook her. Two other points on politics that I'd make. One is watch California. In the old days, California was the last primary. In fact, some of the older folks in the room, I'm sure remember Robert Kennedy, just before he was shot, said, now it's on to Chicago. The convention was the next week. California was the last primary. Now they've changed it. Now it's going to be Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and California. So someone will emerge, a Californian will emerge on the short list. It could be Kamala Harris, who's very aggressive, raised a lot of money, interesting person, half Indian and half African American. But my long shot special is the mayor of Los Angeles, Garcetti, who is part Italian, part Jewish, part Mexican, law school grad, combat veteran. He's been in Iowa a lot in the last few months, and he's definitely running. He's someone you're going to hear a bit about. The other point I'd make on politics is this. If he was 10 years younger, I think Michael Bloomberg would be a serious player. The country is so divided, far left, far right. There's this huge gap in the middle. And you've got someone who ran an ungovernable city quite well, in my opinion. I met him recently at a reception. I didn't have a long talk, but I got to talk to him. He's 76 and he's starting to look at, he's a little bent over, he's getting up there, but razor sharp intellectually. His mind is sharp as a tack. And of course, lest I forget, he's worth $50 billion. So he could spend $4 or $5 billion. That'd be a rounding error for him. And I'm told by people who know him well that he has not ruled out running, despite his age. He has not ruled it out. I think he would have two handicaps. One is he's passionately pro-Wall Street, and the country is not. And number two, he's passionately pro-gun control. That doesn't help him in big parts of the country, places like Texas. But anyway, he could be a factor as well. So you add it all up, coming to the end here now, you add it all up, no clear choice for the Democrats, no obvious winner. You could have said that about Obama many years ago as well. But you've got a president who I think has a plausible chance of winning. So I defer to the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority, of course, is the Las Vegas odds makers, who have made Trump the overwhelming favorite to win re-election. If you go to Vegas, he's the overwhelming favorite. A lot's going to happen between now and then. I would just conclude by saying that for all of you as investors, there's a lot of hype right now. CNBC loves high ratings. People sometimes get worried about things that are not imminent problems. I think we can get through this stretch. It would have been naive to think we wouldn't have a sell-off at some point. I still think the fundamentals are very good. I still think there's a lot of stimulus in the pipeline, monetary and especially fiscal. And I think the key factor of all, the absolute key factor of all for investors begins to show up in the next few days. It's earnings season. And you look at earnings seasons for the last few years, and they've been great. And I see no reason why that trend is going to end. So that's it from me. I think we got time for a couple of questions. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not sure I can use the mic, but do you believe that somebody can enter the situation, do a stimulus in the face of full employment, and impose tariffs, and then not expect that the inflation expectation generated by that will not stimulate the Federal Reserve to raise rates?
Absolutely.
He has people all around him who are bright people. Why would he not anticipate it?
I agree fully. I recommend the Bob Woodward book. It's a fun read, and I think, unlike some of the books which maybe not are totally valid, I think Woodward's book is pretty good. And there are several passages in the book in which he goes up with Gary Cohn, former CEO of Goldman, who knows a bit about the economy, Larry Kudlow, and others who know that you can't overstimulate to this degree without sparking fears of inflation, without sparking a rate increase from the Fed. That's logic. But on many issues, as you read in the Woodward book, there's an absence of that kind of logic from him. And he's had a lot of successes, and I don't. It's easy to knock him, but he really thinks we can grow at 3.5%. Well, sometimes he says 4, sometimes he says, but he feels we can grow at a much higher rate without stimulating any inflation. The only way I could see growth getting higher without any inflation would be a massive influx of immigrant labor, which also would help me on my Social Security benefits, frankly. But he's opposed to that. So I don't see that as being an option for him.
So you don't think that he expected the Fed would raise rates?
I think that he felt he was getting an ally in. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but Trump had the most dovish Fed chairman in our lifetime, and he fired her. So now he's complaining about a more hawkish Fed chairman. Well, maybe he shouldn't have fired Janet Yellen. I think he feels that people who hire will automatically become sycophants. And that's not Jerome Powell. He is not going to be a sycophant for Trump. I can guarantee you that. Other questions? Maybe a couple more, Mike?
Sure.
you think the federal government will bail out the state pension plans?
Well, that's quite a question. If you didn't hear it, will the federal government bail out state pension plans? Unequivocally, no. I don't see the votes there in the House. I think the House would be worried about setting a precedent. There are several states, the poster child for bad behavior is obviously Illinois, the most dysfunctional state in America. But there are other states too, Louisiana, New Jersey, there are many, Connecticut. There are other states that are having pension plans problems as well. But I think any precedent that would be set by Congress to bail them out would set a really bad example. And I think the votes just aren't there in the House to do something like that. Other questions?
Tom, did I see your hand up? Tom? No? I'm
Yeah.
going to put one else here.
Sure.
Redistricting.
Redistricting, yeah. Well, first of all, there's a dramatic demographic trend going on, and you could talk about more Hispanics in Texas, a lot of interesting trends. I would argue one of the most interesting trends is an exodus of people. I'm sorry, I'm from New Hampshire, I'm from New England, but an exodus of people from the Northeast to other areas of the country, fleeing high taxes in Connecticut, bad infrastructure, poor schools, high crime. Where are people going? Nashville, Charlotte, Austin. There are all these cities that are just bursting at the seams. My parent company is based in Charlotte. That city, my God, that city is growing dramatically. So you are going to see a continuation of the trend from the snow belt to the sun belt after the census of the year 2020. And I think the electoral college shift will be dramatic. States like Pennsylvania, which now have 20 votes, probably is going to go down to 16 or 17. Same with Ohio, same with New York. So it's a big shift, and I think it's a reason why the Republicans feel optimistic, even though the country is becoming far more diverse. I think you look at, where I live in Washington, D.C., I travel all around the country. This is a very, very diverse country. But when you look strictly at the Electoral College vote, as we had to a year and a half ago, you see the Electoral College still may tilt to the Republicans.
One more question over there.
What do you see the impact of, well, I would like to say global warming?
Yeah.
But at a minimum, the storms, the fires,
Yeah.
everything else.
Well, I haven't had a drink yet tonight, so don't get me going on this subject. I mean, the evidence, it's self-evident. It's not like this is a mystery to figure out. I have a dear friend who lives in Santa Barbara who nearly died in the fires, and then after the fires there were huge mudslides. She had a friend who did die in the mudslides because there were no trees to hold the water in. You look at this latest hurricane, of course it blew up because the water temperature is off the charts. Why is the water temperature off the charts now? Climate change. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I suppose, to be fair, you could say maybe there's other stuff, the jet stream is acting wacky or sunspots, but I think the likely answer is that this is made by humans. And to ignore that, to me, is mind-boggling. So I don't see any significant changes coming. I had a speech last night, and someone asked me basically the same question. And my response was, if you want to get to Trump on this, you're going to have to go through Ivanka. I think in many respects, Ivanka is more liberal on social issues like that. But Trump has been persuaded that there's absolutely no reason to worry about climate change, and you'll just open up the newspaper, watch the evening news. I mean, you look at the icebergs like falling into the sea. I mean, it's not that difficult to figure out. So that's one of the subjects at my advanced age that still drives me to drink, the inability to deal with this. One more? Okay, maybe if you could get the mic.
Well, you mentioned demographically, you got a lot of people moving from the Rust Belt and north
Yep.
down into Charlotte, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
And you mentioned that that's a reason for the Republicans to feel confident. I would maybe suggest that a lot of people moving from New England are blue. That
Could
might
be.
change the demographics the other way.
Yep, it could be. But time will tell. I think that there are a lot of changes, and my answer was shorthand because there's so many moving parts to this issue. For example, there's been a huge migration of Puerto Ricans into Florida because of the horrible problems in Puerto Rico, exacerbated by their hurricane. So that could change the outcome of the Senate and gubernatorial races in Florida, which look really close. And I do think within a decade, Texas is going to be a toss-up state. I don't think O'Rourke is going to beat Cruz, but you're getting closer to a point where Texas starts to flip as well. So it's a mixed picture, but I just anecdotally, I'm taken aback at how many people who are sick of the taxes, say in Connecticut or New Jersey, are moving to Nashville. I mean, there's a big firm on Wall Street, I forget the name of the company, they moved to Nashville. They announced it anyway a few months ago. So that is a trend that the politicians, I think, in the Northeast have to be aware of.
So
Yes.
can you talk about new trade agreements with Mexico and Canada? I have no idea how to judge whether they're better or worse than that, or just different.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question was Mexico and Canada. I mean, there wasn't a lot different to get Canada to come on board about a month ago. I guess the line, my wife always says this, it could have been worse, you know, and I think it could have been worse if the Canadians had faced a 25% tariff on their autos. It could have really been an ugly trade war. We tinkered around with auto content, with the dispute resolution system. There were some things that had to be resolved. The dairy issue. So Trudeau is just going to subsidize his farmers like Trump is going to subsidize our soybean farmers. So, you know, they all can play that game. I'm happy to see some signs of sanity on trade without a big trade war emerging. You know, one other thing, I know I'm going to get the hook in a minute, I didn't mention, and you said one thing we didn't talk about, and I should just spend 30 seconds on it. If there's a sleeper issue in this election that people are starting to wake up to, it's health insurance. It's back in pre-existing conditions in particular. My sister has a restaurant up in New Hampshire. Her employees worry about that more than anything else. My sister is a severe diabetic who has rheumatoid arthritis, and she talks to me a lot about pre-existing conditions. Is it possible that if Obamacare is abolished, pre-existing conditions goes as well? And many Republicans, not all, but many want to abolish all of this stuff without having any fallback. You know, like, you don't get sick. I mean, they need to have some kind of an alternative. So if there's a sleeper, especially, you know, Claire McCaskill in Missouri is hitting hard because her opponent is very vocal about wanting to abolish all of the health insurance proposals. So that could be one to watch on election night that might move a couple of states.
A round of applause for Greg.
Thank you.